So today we're continuing our message series in the Gospel of John. We call this the Great I Am series because we're seeing this emphasis on one of the aspects of who Jesus is, that He's actually God, that He uses the same I Am name that God uses. And we're seeing several of those statements throughout the Gospel of John. We've got one of them coming up today. And so if you have your Bibles, feel free to grab them and open them up to John chapter 6. We're going to go through the first half of the chapter today, verses 1 through 21. If you don't have a Bible with you, you can grab one from the seat in front of you. In fact, if you don't have a Bible at all, you can even take that one home and keep it as our gift to you. If you're using the Pew Bible like I am, it'll look just like mine, then you can go to page 1068, and that'll help you find where the Gospel of John is. Before we get into the passage, as you're thumbing your way there, I want to just share a personal story. I grew up years ago. Seems like it's longer and longer every day. I grew up years ago in eastern Oregon, in a little ranch outside of Ontario, Oregon. And during the summertime, both my parents were school teachers, but when I was in my younger years, I'd be home from school, and one of the things my dad did when I was in early elementary school is he got his backhoe out, and he made this big pile of dirt right outside the kitchen window. And my mom really liked it because she could be cooking in the kitchen, and she could watch out there and make sure my brother and I hadn't Cain and Abel'd each other or something like that and murdered one another. But she could see what we were doing. And boy, we spent hours out on that dirt mound. It's amazing how entertaining a pile of dirt can be, isn't it? Though some of you have had that experience, right? We had our toy trucks, we had our little shovels, we had our little toy soldiers. We'd set up wars with all of them, and big campaigns would happen over the course of the day. And anyway, we were running around doing that. And at the front of our house, on the route that we'd normally take from the dirt hill over to our faucet, to our outdoor faucet, there was this deep tomb at the front of our house that was there because my father had, when he built our house back in 1983, he had made it with some experimental features, and one of them was there was a vacuum system that would blow foam beads into the panes of all the windows at night to insulate them, and it would vacuum them back out at the end of the day to where the sunlight could come in. And so, anyway, there was this pit that was 15 feet deep out off the front of our house, and the lid for it broke. And so my dad, as I went out, you can kind of guess where this is going. My dad, as I went out to go play on the dirt hill that day, he came to me and said, "Son, you need to be really careful because the cover's off the pit over there at the front of the house. That's normally where you run. So stay off of that. Run across the yard and stay off of that trail or else you're going to end up in that hole." And so I heard what he said. It sounded scary, and it only took me 3 or 4 times before I totally forgot what he said. I was running back and forth, trying to get buckets of water onto the hill. My brother was gone that day for whatever reason, and so I was trying to get this taken care of, and I was racing back and forth. I think I was trying to fill up the hole before the dirt absorbed all of it. So you got to move fast for something like that. The earth is pretty good at absorbing water, as you've probably noticed. And anyway, one of those times, probably the 5th time I ran, I went over there, and I went right, like the Looney Tunes. I fell right into that hole, and I was grabbing it. I was clung onto it just by my nails at the edge of this thing, dangling over this 15-foot fall as a little elementary kid. And I remember I screamed for help, the loudest I've ever screamed. I was yelling for my dad, and I had no idea where he was. It turns out he was about 200 yards away inside of our garage. And my dad was a Vietnam vet, so he has some hearing damage, but somehow, by God's grace, he heard me screaming from clear across the ranch, and he came over, and I remember he came up to me and he said, "Give me your hand," and I'm like, "No, take my hand. I'm not giving you anything." I was, just barely hanging on there, and he reached down and grabbed me and pulled me, and boy, I sure had a sigh of relief after that. Have you guys ever had one of those moments where you were hanging on to the edge, where you felt like you were going to fall, or where you were crying out for help, and you weren't sure if anybody was actually going to make it or not? The disciples are going to have kind of a moment like that at the end of our passage today. We're going to see them wrestling with that. We're in danger, and we don't know what's going to happen. And we're going to talk about in our relationship with God. Sometimes we face those moments, and then how should we face them when we do? So let's go ahead. Again, you can open your Bibles to John chapter 6. And as usual, we're going to break our passage today down into 4 different sections. We'll read each one. We'll stop and we'll discuss it. And I hope that God will help use that to bring it to life for you. We're actually going to begin today with what's often called Jesus feeding the 5,000. We'll find out the 5,000 part's a little bit of a misnomer, but this is actually going to be the 4th of 7 major miracles recorded in the Gospel of John. And so we're going to get an insight into the power that Jesus has as we walk through this. So let's begin with the context in verses 1 through 4. It says, sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on the mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. Okay, that first word we read, sometime after this, we've read this before in previous passages. I want to point out that in the Greek, this is an indeterminate period of time. It's kind of like it sounds in English. If I told you sometime later I did something, does that mean I did it a few hours later, or a few weeks later, or a few years later? It's not clear in this passage. We can narrow it down some, though, because we're reading the Gospel of John here, but there are 4 eyewitness testimonies in the beginning of the New Testament about the life of Jesus. And so by comparing those, we can see some of the events that John doesn't record. And by the way, John not recording those events is not because he's trying to trick anybody. He's read the works of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He knows what they say. And now he's sharing with a different audience what he's observed and passing along those observations and those reflections about the life of Jesus. So by looking at what the others say, we can see it's probably about a 6-month time period since the end of our last chapter where Jesus was in Israel and had healed a crippled man at a pool in Bethsaida. So a good period of time has likely elapsed since then. And we see Jesus, he was over in the Capernaum area on the Sea of Galilee. Now that's it's actually a lake, but they called it a sea back in the day, and it's about 7 miles wide. So Jesus is going to cross from one side to the other side, from the western to the eastern edge of it. And it's good to note contextually, just again, reading the other Gospels and seeing what's happening in current events. Just prior to this, Jesus has sent out all of his disciples for the first time, and he instructed them to go out, to take minimal supplies, and to go out and teach people who he was, to go do miraculous signs that he empowered them to do, like healing people and things like that. He sent them out to go do that for the first time on their own and go share the good news of who he is. And so the disciples have done this. They've returned. They've come back to Jesus and reported on how things went. The people around have become excited by this. Another event that's happened recently, though, just prior to this, is that Jesus also, we see in the other Gospels, has just learned that one of his closest friends in the world, John the Baptist, who was one of the few people who seemed to really understand who Jesus was and what he was doing, John the Baptist ends up being killed by King Herod. And so Jesus finds out one of his best friends is dead, and Jesus really just wants to get away. He wants to go somewhere to pray, to rest, to have some alone time. In the days prior to this, he's been doing a series of several miracles. He's been teaching and healing people, and now he's just wanting to go have some time alone or some time with his disciples to come and reflect on God and look for courage for the things that are coming up ahead. But we see in verse 2 it says that a great crowd followed him. He crossed the sea, but a great crowd followed him because they'd seen the miracles he'd performed recently. They'd seen the stuff he'd done. They'd heard about his disciples. And probably not only that, but they heard about John the Baptist dying. And John the Baptist had said that Jesus was the Christ who'd take away the sins of men. He talked about him as being the Lamb of God. And so if John's dead, these crowds are probably wondering, okay, well then what happens with Jesus now? We know John isn't the Messiah, so what's Jesus going to do? Jesus is going ahead. We see in verse 3 that he heads up onto a mountainside on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. He sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. That means it's a full moon that night if the Passover is near, because the full moon is part of how they determine the season for that. And Jesus goes and sits there, and a giant crowd is going to be following him, as we'll see with what happens next. So let's continue on, starting at verse 5. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for already he had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It'd take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" So again, looking at context, we can look at the other Gospels and infer some new details with this. Jesus actually spends the day out here, ministering to these people. What he really wants is to go cry in the woods and talk to God and get over the death of his best friend. But we see in the other Gospels, it says Jesus sees these crowds coming to him. These guys have run around the Sea of Galilee. They've run around the lake. It was 7 miles straight across, so they've probably gone more than 10 miles. And as they ran, odds are they're running through villages, and people are looking and saying, "Where are you racing off to?" And they're saying, "Oh, we're going to go see Jesus. He was headed that way. We saw his boat. He was going over there. We're going to go try to catch him." And the crowd just keeps growing. In fact, we see here in this passage, or in the passage that's coming up, that there were 5,000 men who came out there. But it's only specifying the number of men. That means that there were still many women and children and others who were there. Most historians say probably somewhere around 15 to 20,000 people have ran around the Sea of Galilee. These towns have emptied out, and people are coming to hear from Jesus, crowding around. And here Jesus is in this place with all of these people here. And for the day, he teaches them, he heals people, he does miracles. And then as the day draws to a close, probably around 4 or 5 p.m., these people are here, but nobody packed a lunch. I mean, they just dropped everything to follow him, and so there's no food to eat. And Jesus asked this kind of terrifying question, actually, initially. He asked Philip, one of the disciples, "Okay, how are we going to feed all these people?" And Philip must be thinking, in terms of earthly standards, "Man, Jesus," he starts to give an honest answer, "Man, if we had 6 months' worth of income, if we had $25,000, then maybe our $25,000 could feed the 20,000 people who are here. But even then, they're in a super rural area. It's not like there's a Costco just down the street they can go to and buy out to feed people. I mean, can you imagine, even if you just had to feed people and I gave you a tractor trailer full of food to do it with, what would be involved in that? Making dinner for 20,000 people? And yet here they are. They don't even have the food. They don't have the capacity to do it. And John is really clear that Jesus is asking this question to Philip, but Jesus knows Philip can't answer the question in the way that Jesus intends. This is sort of a test, and it's really just to emphasize there's this problem. I'm sure Philip's probably thinking to himself, "Hey, did we promise these people a meal? Like, do we have to feed them? What's going on here?" But it's getting towards the end of the day. People are hungry. The disciples haven't eaten all day. Jesus hasn't eaten all day. The whole crowd hasn't eaten all day. And so next, Andrew steps in. And Andrew, we don't hear a lot about as one of the disciples in the Gospels. But when we do hear about him, we see him, especially on 3 occasions, as somebody who's constantly grabbing other people and bringing them to Jesus. In fact, Andrew is one of the first people who became a disciple of Jesus. And the first thing he did after starting to follow Jesus is that he ran over and grabbed his brother Peter and drug him over and said, "Hey, you've got to meet this Jesus guy. This guy's insane. It's crazy what he can do." And so Peter actually becomes a disciple because of Andrew. Now for the second time, Andrew's going, and he finds this little boy who has 5 loaves of bread and 5 fish. And he brings this kid over and tells Jesus, "He's the only one I see who has any food." Now, keep in mind, when we envision this, I don't know what you imagine when they say a loaf of bread. I think most of us think of Wonder Bread loaf or something like that from the grocery store, pre-sliced and stuff like that. That's not what this kid is carrying. Archaeological evidence helps us see what they normally ate back then, so we got some evidence for this. It specifies they were small loaves. Odds are these are like 4 little pieces of pita bread about 4 inches across. That's what this kid has. And we also see it's barley flour that he's eating. Now that's interesting too, because wealthier people, if you were middle class or up in Jesus' day, you would have eaten wheat bread. You would have eaten that. Poor people ate barley flour. Barley flour was cheaper, so it was easier to get a hold of. And if that's what you had to eat, it's what you had to eat, but it doesn't taste as good. Well, I guess taste is subjective. You can determine that. But anyway, this kid is poor. He's got these 5 little pitas that are 4 inches wide. And then we hear he has 2 small fish. Now, as you might guess, if I handed you a fish and said, "Why don't you hang on to this for the whole day and eat it come dinner time," how good would it be by the time dinner time came? Have you ever seen a fish sit out in the sun for the day? And mind you, they're in a desert climate. It's not going to be appetizing by then. Now, that's not what this kid is. It's not like he's carrying around 2 Chinook salmons with him and taking those with him. What he's got with him are likely, from the description, attuned to something like sardines that we have nowadays. Just a little tiny anchovy, small. And normally to preserve those, what they would do is that they would either salt them and dry them out, smoke them and salt them, or they would pickle them. Actually, back then they did pickling. And so probably what's intended here is this little boy, his mom was the only one who packed him a lunch. She sent him away with it, though. And here he's got his 4 little pita breads, or his 5 little pita breads, and he's got 2 little anchovies that are pickled that he could use kind of like a little dressing or a relish on top of the bread. Put a half a fish on each, and he can get a little tiny sandwich. That's all he's got. Yeah, I can't help but wonder sometimes, what did the kid feel like? You know, if you were that kid and there's 20,000 people here and nobody packed lunch except for you, and then Jesus, the super important person everybody came to see, he calls you forward. One of his disciples grab you and drag you up there, and he's like, hey, kid, let me see your lunch. And and I can't help but wonder, I'd be like, hey, you could get your own, Jesus. This is mine, You should have packed if you wanted lunch. But the kid doesn't do that at all. He's not selfish. He's not threatened by this. And think about it too. How hungry do kids get in the course of a day? I mean, this is a young kid. My kids eat, and an hour later they're starving to death. It's amazing how much they can eat. But this kid hasn't eaten all day. He's got his sack lunch, and he hands it right over to Jesus as an act of faith. Okay, I can go a day without eating. How many kids would say that? How many adults would say that? But he passes it off, gives it to Jesus. But still, you've got to be wondering, how did we fix any problems? I mean, what do we get, a pair of tweezers and everybody gets a crumb? We just drop a little crumb in everybody's mouth? How can we feed 20,000 people with 5 loaves of bread, and not even real loaves like we think of them today, and 2 little anchovies? Well, let's see what happens. I guess we'll find out. Continuing on with verses 10 through 15. Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves and gave thanks and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Okay, so again, we're probably at 4 or 5 in the afternoon, and we're going to tracking this because we're going to continue through the day after we finish this section. But Jesus instructs that they have the people go sit down. And now one of the other Gospels, it actually says that Jesus had them split up into units of 50 and 100. And it's interesting because the word used in the Greek to describe the way that they all looked as they were all sat out in these units of 50 or 100 actually says that the term used for the groupings is a term in the Greek you'd use to describe a garden, like a group of plants in a garden. And it's almost reminiscent of when Jesus, in a previous chapter, is seeing the Samaritan people coming to him in a mass to try to learn who he is and figure out if he's the Messiah or not. When he says to his disciples that the fields are thick and ready for harvest, that here we have a great harvest we can have. You almost get that same sort of imagery from this. I'll say also, from a practical standpoint, if you can break people up into units of 50 and 100, it would be a lot easier from a logistical standpoint to go and make sure you actually got bread. I mean, imagine if I sent 10 of you out into a group of 20,000 people and said, make sure everybody gets bread. Not only do we not have enough bread to begin with on its surface, but even if we did have the bread, just trying to make sure people got it. There'd be people who were done eating at the front of the group before people at the back even got their food. So how would you know if you got through it or not? By having them grouped like this, we can do it. And so Jesus goes, he takes that bread, he gives thanks to God for it. Now, isn't that interesting? Before the miracle happens, he stops and he thanks God for not enough bread and not enough fish. And somehow, thanking God for not enough bread and not enough fish, God makes it into enough. And then he sends his disciples around. And notice, it says here in John, he's very clear. He says, go and give them as much as they want. I mean, before we talked about if you had $25,000, maybe everybody could have one bite of bread. But there's such an abundance that they are able to go out among the crowd and give them as much as they want. Yeah, you want 15 loaves of bread? Here's 15 pitas. Have at it. And just hand off the fish and the bread. Now, this miracle on its face is pretty miraculous, but it's even more miraculous when you compare it to some of the past miracles Jesus did. A past culinary miracle Jesus did in chapter 2 of the Gospel of John was that he turned water into wine. Now, that was interesting because all he had was a bunch of jugs of water. And somehow he turned a bunch of jugs of water into high-grade wine. And that's hard to explain. That would be hard to do. But imagine in this case, he doesn't have something else to use to turn into something else. He simply takes the bread and he multiplies it and creates matter out of thin air. How long would you have to sit in your kitchen before you could figure that one out? Be a while, right? It would help my grocery bills, though. My kids would probably get sick of pita bread and sardines, though. But that's an incredible miracle. Thousands of times over, this bread gets multiplied. It gets handed out to this crowd. The fish, the same thing. Everybody gets as much as they want. They distribute it to the whole crowd. Everybody gets a chance to eat. And then Jesus, when they're done, he doesn't stop there. He tells them, go out to the crowds with these baskets. So the 12 of them go out with baskets and collect all of the leftover bread that's still there. And so they come up with 12 heaping baskets of bread that are left. Well, the 5 loaves certainly couldn't have done that to begin with. And yet, by Jesus' power, and this miracle is almost reminiscent of what God does for the people of Israel when they're wandering in the wilderness, when he provides manna from heaven. God causes manna to fall from heaven, just miraculously makes this. Here, we see something echoing that. Jesus is doing something only God has done historically. He makes food out of thin air and distributes it. Coming back, we have these 12 baskets, and there's a lot of imagery that carries through at this. People have pointed out that the 12 baskets could be paralleling the 12 tribes of Israel that were there. That's true. The 12 baskets could be paralleling the 12 disciples. And if there's an evangelistic context to this miracle, if Jesus is trying to show that when the gospel comes out, that no matter how much of the truth of who God was you started with, you can hand it out and hand it out and hand it out and never run out. And even when you're done, there's going to be enough of it left over that you can still give it to more people. You'll have 12 baskets left, and these 12 disciples will have this much more of the gospel to carry forward. Those images are important, and those are interesting questions we can ask. And I think probably that last idea is the right one. But that said, the thing we most want to avoid missing here is that this is an absolute miracle. How could you trick people into this? How could you possibly have it not be real? And I say there's skeptics who read passages like this, and they try to find natural ways to explain it. But how, even if Jesus was a magician, if he wasn't actually supernaturally empowered, how could he trick all these people into doing this? How long could you carry around a basket handing out bread that never ended before it would seem like it was a miraculous thing? I mean, did Jesus have a tractor trailer buried nearby he was getting it all from? Obviously, the miraculous answer is the only one that makes any sense. And there are thousands of witnesses here to see it. Somehow Jesus created matter out of nothing and fed thousands of people. Now, you notice the crowd's response. We're told they see this and they say, oh man, this must be the prophet that the Old Testament talked about. In the other Gospels, some of them actually mention it, the prophet that Moses talked about. But specifically, they're talking about prophecies about the Messiah. And on its face, you can accurately say Jesus is a prophet. He clearly has the ability to tell things that no human would normally be able to tell. But he's more than that. He is the Messiah. The challenge here is that the crowd, a lot like his disciples at points, the crowd are actually hoping he is going to be a political and military leader. And Jesus isn't here to save them from Rome. He's here to save them from something much more evil, their own hearts, their own brokenness and division from God. So Jesus sees this, knows what their intent is, knows that they, as John tells us, wanted to come by force and take him. They're just going to grab him and drag him off to Jerusalem, put him on a throne and tell Rome, come and try to fight him if you want. You'll never win. And Jesus knows that, and that's not what his ministry is. He's actually at the peak of his popularity now. We'll see in the course of the Gospels, this is about the apex of public opinion of Jesus. Once they see this, they think, oh my goodness, this person is the Messiah. He is incredible. We could take over the world with somebody like this. We don't even need supply lines for our military. He'll just make bread and fish when we need it, and we're good to go on that front. But that's not actually what Jesus' ministry is about. And so as we see that section draw to a close, Jesus sends his disciples away, he sends the crowds away, and he goes up, sneaks off onto the mountain where nobody can follow him, and he goes and spends time in prayer. And I find it interesting even that he spends time in prayer, because we can see from the chronology of what's happened, Jesus is exhausted. If anything, I'd think he'd want sleep. But even for Jesus, the most important thing when you're crushed, when things are falling apart, when things are going wrong, is to talk to God. There's something to be heard in that. So Jesus goes and does that. Now, interestingly, if we kind of run through the chronology, how long would it take you to feed 20,000 people? Probably at least 4 hours. And we read that in the beginning of the next passage, it's getting dark as all this happens. So probably we're at about 9 p.m. at this point. And that's relevant because there's one of the other Gospels that timestamps what happens when Jesus meets up with the disciples next. And we can see it's actually going to be 6 hours later before they meet up again. I also want to mention, we talked about it being the Passover. That means, for context for what we're going to read next, that that it's springtime, and certainly Passover on the Jewish calendar is around the time that Easter is on our calendar. So it's springtime, the grass was extra lush and green. It also means that where Passover happens, normally it happens in proximity to a full moon. And so it's going to be light out in the dark, or it's going to be more light than normal out in the dark. Let's go ahead and continue on and read the final part of this passage then with verses 16 through 21. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Okay, so roughly 9 o'clock at night, at that time of year when it would get dark, they head off. And mind you, there's 4 professional fishermen on this boat who have spent their entire lives on this body of water, on this large freshwater lake called the Sea of Galilee, fishing for a living here. They know this place, they know the water and the nature of it, and they all set out together. They need to cross 7 or so miles across the lake. Today it would be 7 miles from place to place, although actually back then the best archaeological evidence suggests that the water line was actually quite a bit higher. We find docks that are, a few hundred yards up from where current docks are that we found ruins for, so that means odds are 2,000 years ago the water was at a slightly different spot. Go figure, Not everything stays the same, as you might have noticed. And so they're crossing this body of water. And as they do, in the Greek, it shows us this progression that's happening, that the storm comes and it's getting worse and worse and worse. We can imagine they've got a bad headwind coming to them, and they are paddling like crazy. They should have been able to get across the Sea of Galilee within a few hours, and instead, they're out here rowing for their lives, and they're halfway across in the middle of the sea, and they're not getting anywhere. They're worried as the waves are licking up more and more. And in the other Gospels, it makes it really clear. They're starting to fear for their lives. What's going to happen to us here? Are we going to make it out of this? Now, Jesus has been up on this hilltop. 6 hours ago, he went up there to go pray, and he's come down. And they have this miraculous thing happen where they are in this storm, watching what's happening, well lit by the moonlight, and yet waves and wind kicking them all over. And they look out, and they see, walking as if he's going to pass them by, Mark says, that it's as if he's passing them by, Jesus is walking out on top of the water. Not swimming, mind you, but just stepping on it like it was a sidewalk. Now, it's fascinating that Mark uses that Greek word for passing by, because the word he uses for that is actually the exact same word in Greek translations of the Old Testament, where it talks about God's presence passing by people, like when Moses was on Mount Sinai and God's presence passed by him. And so this is another allusion to Jesus' deity, that Jesus is going to pass them by, or they feel like he's going to pass them by. And they look out and they see him, and they are terrified. In fact, one of the other Gospels says they think there's a ghost out there. And, just to ask you, if you were out on the water in a storm in the middle of the night and you saw a person walking on the water, who would be your first guess? Well, maybe it'd be Jesus for you because you've already heard the story, but for most people, who could do that? A ghost is probably not your worst guess. Might as well be a ghost because nobody can walk on water. That's not a thing. And yet, here Jesus is doing it. And so he comes over and he says, as you can see here in verse 20, he sees them, they're terrified, they're already worried about drowning, and now there's some guy walking on the water or some ghost out on the water, they're not sure what. But Jesus said to them, "It is I." Now, in the English, they're using "it is I" here, but actually in the Greek, it's the words ego eimi, which are the words for I am, or I am he. So Jesus here, for the second time, is using this phrase that is used of the name of God in the Old Testament. God, like for example, when Moses is before the burning bush, Moses asks God, "Who should I say has sent me to go talk to Pharaoh? What name should I give them?" And God says to Moses, "Tell them I am has sent you." I am, because I'm the God who actually exists. I'm actually true, a person, I'm real. And so here, Jesus uses that exact same name to describe himself. I am, right in the middle of the miracle. And the disciples would have a hard time missing what's implied by this. And he tells them, you don't need to be afraid. So once they realize what's going on here, that Jesus somehow has taken a casual walk on a stormy lake, they invite him into the boat. And that's not the end of the miracle. Jesus gets in the boat, and somehow, whether by teleportation or a violent current or what, we don't know, they move from the middle of the Sea of Galilee 3.5 miles to their destination in an instant. They're here in the middle, and now they're at where they were going to stop. And they don't know how they got there, but somehow once Jesus set foot in the boat, we arrived. Now, I'll point out, too, that one of the other Gospels actually adds in the detail here of the Apostle Peter stepping out to meet Jesus on the water. Peter initially is able to walk on water once Jesus invites him to, but then he looks away from Jesus and realizes, I'm walking on water, this is insane, and he starts to sink, and Jesus rescues him. John leaves that particular part of the account out. That's not what his focus is. But still, we can see all this is happening. Now, again, as we talk through this, there are many people who want to dismiss the Bible, want to say, this probably didn't happen. And they have all kinds of ideas for how that might be. Some people say, hey, maybe they were all hallucinating. But, a funny thing with hallucinations are, if you have a group of 12 men who are, say, using magic mushrooms, are they all going to hallucinate exactly the same thing in exactly the same time frame? No. So the hallucination thing, maybe one guy could hallucinate, but 12 of them all agreeing exactly on what happened and all seeing the exact same thing, probably not the case. Others have said, maybe they just didn't really know where they were and Jesus tricked them and he was actually just walking on the shallow part of the shore and he looked like he was on the water, but he wasn't. But again here, we have 4 people who have lived their life, probably more time on this stupid lake than on land. Do you really think they're going to be confused by this? I feel like making this excuse for how the Bible's not true is a bit attuned to me saying, yeah, I'm going to go to my mechanic and I'm going to tell him, this isn't a key, it's a magic wand, and my car, it runs on wizardry. What are odds he would believe me? Probably not, right? Yeah, he'd be like, you're really special, Lloyd, but no, yeah. And I'm not going to your church. Yeah, forget about that if this is what you think. But really, it's about as rational. These guys know exactly what's going on. They know where they're at. That's why they're scared for their lives. And so all of this is happening, and it clearly seems to be the exact event. They have no motive to make it up, because these guys all go live their lives and die following Jesus. They give up comfortable lives and take on uncomfortable and yet gratifying ones following Jesus after he dies. This happened. This miracle occurred. So in the course of just a day, we've seen Jesus kick out several miracles here. He's created food out of thin air. He's walked on water. He's gone and teleported a boat from one side of a lake to another. It's pretty terrifying. Now, I want to ask you a question as we think about this, though. The disciples are out on the boat. They're terrified before Jesus shows up. Not sure if they're going to make it or not. Not sure if they're going to be drowning. If they can't move across the lake in a boat, odds are they're not going to swim it either. At any given point, was Jesus any less powerful and capable of delivering them from their situation? No, he wasn't. Whether Jesus was praying on the mountain or whether Jesus was walking on the water, Jesus was still more than powerful enough to deliver them from the circumstances they're in. And you might wonder, well, do they have a rational basis to expect that he would deliver them? And I'd say yes, because Jesus has been training them in order to go spread his word. He's told them they're going to go out and be his witnesses across the world, so they know that this is part of what their calling is, and you can't do that if you're dead. There's a complexity. Jesus still has a purpose for their life. He's not going to let them die, and yet they're terrified and worried about what's going to happen next. They're a little bit like me, hanging from that pit, clawing on with my life, crying out, hoping somebody hears me. But in their case, there's not a question about whether they're hurt or not. In mine, there was. My dad could have been 40 acres away. He didn't have to be nearby. But for them, calling out to God, trusting in Jesus, Jesus was never far enough away that they were really in danger. Well, that's kind of crazy. I want to ask you guys, are you in a time in your life right now? Or for that matter, have you been in a time recently where you kind of felt like that, where you felt like you were clinging from the edge, like you were clawing on? For the disciples, they knew that they were safe and that they could be delivered because they had a promise from God about what he was going to do with them, because they were pursuing God's kingdom first. And I want to challenge you guys today to say, boy, there are times in this life where things go wrong, where they seem broken, where you're not sure if you can even get one foot in front of the other. And that can be a hard part of the human experience. If you haven't felt that yet, let me tell you, you live long enough, you'll experience it. It's just a matter of time. I'm not trying to discourage you. I'm just trying to help you have realistic expectations. You're going to have those moments of hardship. And yet, the Jesus who did the miracles back then still has power to deliver you now. And if you're living only for yourself, well, he doesn't have much reason to be frank. But if you're living your life focused on his kingdom, focused on submitting to him and doing what he wants, well, then he's got a purpose for you in his kingdom. And maybe he will allow you to die, but he'll still deliver you into heaven. But quite probably, he'll come and he'll actually pull you from the fires. He'll pull you from that pit. He'll save you from that water that's trying to come and take you over. And I want to encourage you guys, sometimes we lose hope, even as believers nowadays. And I know that, we didn't see him feed 5,000, so maybe we feel like we didn't see the same miracles they saw. But let me ask you, for those of you who are followers of Jesus, has the way that Jesus Christ transformed your life been anything short of miraculous in the time that you've known him? No. I see a lot of heads nodding no. I can tell you, for me, it was not. The person I was before and the person he has been gradually transforming me into, those are very different things. And for that matter, if you're not a Christian, have you seen somebody who has been living in a destructive way, going down some bad paths, and yet they turn to Jesus and he starts to change their heart? He starts to make the brokenness in their life and bind it together and make it new. God may not be doing the exact same miracles he did there as often now as he does then as he does now. The variability of that may change. But the miracle of our hearts being transformed, the miracle of our lives being different, it's still there. And if God loves you enough that he gave his son for you, if he cares about you enough that he wants to transform you, not just for your own sake, but for the sake of his kingdom, then don't you think he knows where you're at? Don't you think he hears you as you're crying out from that pit? I think we sometimes don't give God near enough credit. The disciples were missing it. They saw all these miracles, and still they were worried they might die. And I want to encourage you today, if you're walking through one of those valleys, God is big enough to deliver you. Now, you may be crying out to God because your car broke down, and I'll tell you, God may deliver you with a bicycle. It may not be with a Lamborghini. He may not deliver you exactly the way you want. And I know that's not exciting to hear. Hey, I hope it's a Lamborghini. That'd be fun to see. But that may not be the deliverance he gives. But God is there. He's listening. He cares. Jesus never once forgot about who his disciples were or lost concern for them. He was always there and always sufficient to save them. And God is in that same position today. As you walk through these valleys in your life, as you're not sure what comes next, I want to encourage you. The same God who was there by the boat then is the God who is here in your life now. And if you'll turn to him and focus your life on him, then before you know it, you'll see him standing next to you, walking through it with you. At this point, I'm going to ask Tim, one of our leaders, to come forward and lead us in our time of communion and offering. Josh will lead us in some closing music. As they come forward, I'll ask you guys to join me for a moment of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you. Thank you that you're a God who hears us when we cry out to you, that we can sit there clinging by our fingernails from the edge. But we don't have to worry about you being 40 acres away. You're always there. You always hear. Lord, we thank you that you loved us enough to send your Son for us. And Father, I don't know how many people today are struggling with that fear, who feel like they're clinging on by their nails. But I pray that you would help your Spirit's presence to be felt. I pray that they would turn their lives over to you, submit them to you, and await for your deliverance in those tough situations life sends. Please help us to look first to find our hope in our greatest deliverer, in Jesus Christ. We pray in his name. Amen.